Folks, I really appreciate you all making time to come out and be part of this town hall process. This is important for a bunch of different reasons. First of all, and most importantly, it's a chance for all of us to understand better what's on your mind. That's our prime purpose in doing this. I'm also going to be sharing a little bit about what I'm hoping to do as your next director. And hopefully this will be the beginning of a process that we will keep doing throughout the next 3 years at least, and maybe longer. I really think it's important, if we're going to be about transparency and really listening to members, that we make that actionable. And this town hall meeting is a first step to try and do that. We'll share more in a little bit about how we're going to build on that. So it's 7 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome, everybody. I want to thank you again for joining my town hall this evening. And also, particularly, many of you took the time to ask and send in some very thoughtful questions. We're going to try to answer as many of those, hopefully all of them, if we have enough time. But we will leave some time for live Q&A. If you want, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you click on that, it'll bring up a dialog where you'll be able to see the live questions as they're asked, and also put your own live questions in. So I'm Fred Kemmerer. My amateur radio call sign is AB1OC. And joining me tonight are a panel of folks who have been working with me to help us prepare our plans for becoming director, and have been working on my campaign. And so I want to thank everybody on the panel and all who took the time out tonight to be part of this process. So I'd like to begin with a short presentation that I think will get us into the Q&A, and also help you understand a little bit more about what I'm trying to do as director. So with that, I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint here. Panel, give me a thumbs up if we're good on the PowerPoint. Yep, very good. All right, so let's dive into this. The first thing I'd like to do is have the panelists introduce themselves. So with that, Phil, would you like to go ahead and begin?
Thank you, Fred. Good evening, everybody. I'm Phil Temples, K9HI. I'll read my bio here. I've been a radio amateur now for over 50 years. I'm an ardent supporter of the ARRL, as many of you are, I'm sure. I've served in many capacities in the local field organization, including multiple terms as section manager, assistant section manager, and affiliated club coordinator. I currently serve as the ARRL New England Division Vice Director. This evening, though, I'm with you as just a regular ARRL member, and I would like to say that I think Fred Kemmerer would make an outstanding New England director. His mentorship and youth involvement are critical for the growth of our hobby service and the ARRL. His involvement with a large active radio club, the Nashua Area Radio Society, his mentoring at a program that he created called Ham Boot Camp, as well as his tireless work as an ARISS, that's amateur radio aboard the International Space Station, mentor and ground station. His work with FCC and Standards Committee involvement, his industry experience makes him uniquely qualified to understand and appreciate the types of activities that will advance the ARRL at a national level, as well as here in New England.
All right, thank you very much, Phil. Corey, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Fred. My name is Corey Golub, amateur call sign Kilo Uniform 1 Uniform. I'm up in the great state of Maine, been a ham for a while now, 26 years, and currently serving in ARRL as the assistant section manager and section traffic manager. Professional background for me, emergency dispatch, did that for about 18 years, and now I'm working in 911 administration, so MCOM is near and dear to my heart. But in addition to that, I stay in contact with amateur radio clubs throughout the state, making sure that I have a pulse on what they're doing, keeping active with them. And in that, where clubs, I believe, are the cornerstone of this hobby, is why I'm vowing my support for Fred Kemmerer AB1OC. What he has done with clubs is just a testament to who he is and what he can do for this hobby.
Thank you, Corey. very much. Larry, would you like to introduce yourself next? Larry, I think you might be on mute. There you
Okay, let's try this. Good evening, all. I'm Larry, W1AST. I'm the president of the Hamden County Radio Association in Western Massachusetts. I'm an ARRL Life member. I've been a ham for 44 years. I do a lot of CW, sideband, and pretty much anything that interests me, ham radio, fox hunting, satellite in the future, and other things. And one of the things that interests me is making the clubs in New England more active and a better place. I don't have an official position, but have some things coming up that will benefit all the clubs in the in New England. And one of the reasons I'm here helping Fred is because I believe what he's doing and how he's doing it will benefit all clubs and all hams, especially all the hams in New England, and eventually maybe across the country as well. So that's me, Larry, W1AST, out here in Western Mass. Back to you, Fred.
Thank you, Larry. And Rob, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so good evening, everybody. This is Rob Macedo, KD1CY, Eastern Mass, Aries, SEC, and Skywarn Coordinator for National Weather Service, Boston Norton, and also a life member of the league, and kind of removing the titles, except for maybe being a life member of the league. I'm here tonight also to support Fred Kemmerer in his run for division director. And the reason is there's certainly the issues with the league and such, but I think there are even greater issues, and that's with keeping the amateur radio service relevant, vibrant, not just even from emergency communications public service perspective, but from just a general perspective of having a lot of members of all ages join amateur radio, and then hopefully join the league as well. But I think it's amateur radio service first, ARRL second, and then kind of how we can help both the league and the amateur radio service, but it's putting service ahead of others. And I think Fred has a huge track record of that with everything that he's done with the Nashua Club and with the International Space Station and so forth. And after kind of reviewing everybody and such, I think the key thing is, right, it's one vote on the board to affect the league changes, but it's also trying to grow amateur radio in the New England division, and also keeping existing folks and new licensees active and involved in amateur radio. And I think Fred can be a leader in all those areas while also maintaining the kind of core traditional principles of amateur radio, the contesting, DXing, all of those other facets and things that hams who've been around a long time hold dear and feel are important. So it's looking at growing the service in the future, but also maintaining everybody's involvement in the service and what they love about this service / hobby that has so many different facets to it. Fred?
Thank you so much, Rob. And I just want to say that I feel very blessed to have a group of folks like you and the rest of the team that's helping me with this run. And all your support is much appreciated. Okay, so I'd like to introduce myself. Many of you may not know much about me. I've been an amateur radio licensee for 11 years now. Been very active, making over 100,000 contacts in that amount of time, in a mix of contesting, DXing, special event station operating, and just getting on the air and chewing the rag. I've devoted a lot of my time for the last 4 or 5 years towards the activities that you see here. I really believe it's important to get new hams licensed and to get them on the air. And it's also really important to help hams build new skills and keep the hobby exciting for everybody. I've done a lot of work to bring STEM learning through amateur radio into schools. In my role as an ARRL mentor and ground station, I work with schools all around the world to help them experience amateur radio in a high-tech context of talking with astronauts on the International Space Station. And our ability to inspire young people and to bring support for amateur radio and awareness in the general public is unmatched in some of those programs. As was mentioned earlier, I've had the privilege of leading and building one of the largest amateur radio clubs in New England. That success is largely driven by the club's commitment to the things you see on this chart, bringing new people into the hobby, building skills, getting folks on the air. And a little bit at a personal level, along with my wife, Anita, AB1QB, we enjoyed DXing. I've done quite a bit of contesting. Lately, most of it's on 6 meters and above, so I've kind of gone into that area. And I really enjoy station building a lot, and write a blog that's pretty widely followed that shares information with the whole amateur radio community worldwide on how you can do that. So what I'd like to set the stage for here and begin answering some questions about what I intend to try to do, what my priorities are as director. Our first question comes from Dick, K1HC in Westwood, Massachusetts. And the first part of Dick's question is, what are your first priorities? And then he goes on to ask, how will I approach fulfilling those priorities? And will there be any new directions? So these are a few things that are kind of my going in top priorities. As I've been discussing already and been doing, I really want to focus New England and the ARRL on bringing new people into amateur radio. And I really believe this needs to be done as a collaborative effort with clubs. Most amateurs, when they look for a mentor, they look for an Elmer, they look around and they reach out to their local clubs for that kind of help. Clubs can also play key roles in licensing and skills building and lots of other things. And I guess what will be a little bit different about my view is that some directors, I think, focus mostly on the internals of the ARRL. And that's really important to do. But I also believe your director should be focusing on building the amateur radio environment for all the ARRL members in their division. And so for me, this is about a dual mission to do both of those things. I want to create a focus for involvement in STEM learning. STEM, by the way, is science, technology, engineering, and math. It's basically about encouraging school students to pursue technical type careers as they go through life. And I think there's a lot we can do in New England and the ARRL can do to forward that mission. It also helps us solve many problems much beyond just creating the next generation of hams. We'll be talking about that as we go. I think it's really important that we rebuild a positive public awareness and support for amateur radio. You know, you all are probably very familiar with the many bills and legislation we've tried to pass to protect our amateur radio rights. And while there have been a lot of good legislation written, very little meaningful legislation has been passed. And the reason that it's not getting passed is not about writing bills. It's about public support and awareness for amateur radio. And so if we really want to have legislation that protects our hobby, we absolutely have to focus on this stuff. And some of the previous items, particularly our work in schools, does double duty because not only do we expose young people to amateur radio, but we expose their parents to what amateur radio can do to change their kids' lives for the better. And that kind of public support is the kind of stuff that gets legislation passed. So the third item here is very much, in my mind, tied up with doing the first two. I think we need real effective two-way communications. You know, some folks have been campaigning on the notion that they're going to make the ARRL more transparent. I think that's helpful. But I think what's more important is that we need a culture of listening more than we're speaking. And we need to act and be accountable for the feedback that we get. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in a second about how I'm going to do that. And then lastly, as I said, in my mind, the director's role is a dual role, one that looks inside the ARRL to try to improve the situation and make it stronger. But it also should be your director's responsibility to work with the members across New England, along with the field staff, to try to make amateur radio stronger, create new programs, get hams, individual hams and clubs involved in these other activities. And basically, my goal is to make New England a leader in world-class programs of that type, and then take them as examples of what's working into the ARRL and gain ARRL support. Okay, So you might say, well, gee, there are a lot of candidates out there. They're all saying a lot of the same things you are. What makes you any different? Well, why should we pick you? Well, a lot of my professional experience is in executive leadership roles in some pretty large companies. And every job that I've ever had as an executive came with an understanding that I had 100 days to prove that I could do the job well, or I would be replaced. And anybody who's served in an executive role knows that that's pretty much how that works. So I think a director is a pretty darn important role, and a director ought to have a 100-day plan, a 100-day commitment that you can hold your director accountable for getting done. And if they don't get them done, you should be asking them to resign. So here's my 100-day plan. If we're going to get anything done in the ARRL, we need a leader who's going to reach out to all the board members and the senior leadership in the ARRL and find common ground to take action on the issues that matter to amateur radio and matter to you. I've had several positions, including one where I set the agenda and did exactly this on a very broad-based industry board. It was the ADIS board, and my job was to work with all the service providers for telecom, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and others, and all the vendors, Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei, and so on, Cisco, and get all those companies to agree on things to work on to solve industry problems. I think that experience is very relevant to the situation we have here. And the way I did that, and the way I think it needs to be done, is by working across and spending time with all the board members proactively to understand what they're trying to do and try to create common ground that we can build on to get problems solved. I've already begun this outreach, and I'm hoping to have a fair amount of it done by the time the election is done. Communications is about listening and acting and taking feedback to heart. Publishing indexes of board orders and other things like that, that's helpful, but that's not what transparency is really about. This town hall is an example of what transparency is going to mean if I'm elected. We're going to do lots of these. And we're also going to have not one or an occasional cabinet meeting, and not one just when there's a board meeting. We're going to have at least 4 cabinet meetings a year. Your feedback from these town halls and other sources is going to be read out by our vice director at the beginning of every one of those cabinet meetings, and it will set the stage for everything we work on in those meetings. That's how you make two-way feedback actionable and accountable, okay? No one person has the breadth of skills needed to solve the full range of problems that we're facing. And my solution to that is I'm going to be appointing assistant directors that will be responsible for working with the field staff, the clubs, and the individual ARRL members in New England to develop programs and solve problems initially in 4 areas. A focus for mentoring new ham development, the kind of programs that we can do as groups to bring new people in the hobby and get them on the air. Youth outreach and STEM learning through amateur radio. We want to step up our ability to be in schools and build that positive public support for amateur radio and awareness. Emergency communications and public service is a core function that has been an important part of amateur radio for a long, long time. I'm proud to say that I think New England is one of the strongest divisions in terms of our capabilities and our commitment to this. And I want to see an assistant director brought in to focus on that area to help, especially as the league goes through the process of redefining its role in emergency communications, that be sure we're an active part of that process and we're leading the way. And then lastly, it's very important to protect and promote our hobby that we all enjoy so much. A lot of this needs to focus around protection of spectrum because our higher bands, our VHF and above, are under siege right now. And that's probably not going to get better. And the way we need to do this is we need to promote the use and find creative ways to demonstrate the importance of us keeping our spectrum. This includes a lot of things we enjoy, like DXing and contesting, and how we bring new people into those activities and build programs around using our HF spectrum as well as VHF and above. And then lastly, I think it's very, very important that we stay in touch with clubs, because we're counting on clubs and groups such as the folks here to make New England the shining star for these kinds of activities that we want to make it. And we can't do it, and the league can't do it, unless you all decide what those programs and projects are and you band together and participate. I personally am a club person. I believe that clubs are the way to get this stuff done. And to demonstrate that ongoing commitment, I think it's important that we, including my assistant directors and our vice director, spend a lot of time with clubs. I'm going to personally commit to be in at least 6 club meetings every quarter while I'm in office. If Zoom persists the way it looks like it might in some hybrid formats, I may be able to do 2 or 3 times that amount. As it stands right now, I'm attending 2 to 3 club meetings every single week to try to get in touch with what people want to have done, and also to begin some of the advocacy for some of these programs. Let me read the rest of the questions here. The rest of Dick's question is, how do you maintain and improve as necessary in existing processes and organizations within the division? Basically, we're going to do that 2 ways. One way we're going to do it is we're going to create successful solutions and processes in New England, and we're going to hold those up to the ARRL process and say, this is already working in New England. Why can't we do this? That's a much faster process than trying to go internal into committees, debating things for years, sometimes, or at least months, and oftentimes not getting the kind of active input from the ARRL membership that we need to shape the best solution. Don't get me wrong, the committee process is important and it should go on, but I really believe that we can have a tremendous positive impact if we take on some of these problems, we experiment and innovate some solutions, and then we hold those up and ask the ARRL to promote them, feed them into the committee working process, try to appoint our members to be part of those working groups, and that will just simply speed things up. John McCoby, N1ILZ asks, solving the ARRL's problems needs to be coordinated, committed efforts of the entire executive team, including the officers and the entire board of directors. If elected, how will you convince your fellow directors to adopt your proposals? The same way I did it in my industry experience. You got to spend time with people. You got to understand what they're trying to do. You got to work really hard to find common ground and get people to start to work together around that common ground. You know, the directors I've talked to and some of the senior leaders, they actually care very much about many of these same issues that you do. There might be a lot of debate about how to best solve them, but I don't think most of the leadership, the ARRL would suggest that the things we've been talking about here so far and the things you're asking questions about are not the right problems. The thing that we need to do is somebody who will work to build that common ground in addition to work to represent their division. All right. So with that, let's go into the Q&A. I'll have a little bit at the very end to kind of tie a bow on this. But with that, I think, let's say, Phil, I believe you've got the first round of questions. Do you want to ask away?
I will. Thank you, Fred. Good evening again, everyone. The first question comes from Lem Skidmore, W1LEM in Brewster, Massachusetts. He asks, what is the biggest problem and what is the biggest opportunity you see for ARRL in general and the division in particular?
The biggest problem and the biggest opportunity are the same. In my mind, it's very simple. We need to bring new people into amateur radio and get them active. If you look around at the situation, be you into contesting, emergency communications, any amateur radio activity you could think of, we're all talking about the same problem. The amateur radio community is aging, and we're not generating enough new hams and young people to build that next generation. In my mind, that's the focus and one of the #1 things that I'm planning to do as director. I think I just hopefully explained pretty well how we're going to do that. We're going to work through clubs. A good example, one of the things I want to do is I want to create an age-appropriate licensing class for grades 5 through 12 as a way to create a more effective outreach to young people and to join the amateur radio service. And I believe I can make our division a leader in that work. I also think that our assistant director will be, and the field staff will be working together with clubs to do the same sort of work.
Very good, Fred. The next question comes from Betsy Doan, K1EIC from Shelton, Connecticut. Betsy is a longtime field organization volunteer and a section manager for years. And she asks, how do you view the role of the board? Should the board lean toward managing the organization? And have you looked at the org chart? What changes, if so, what changes would you work toward making? And I would just like to tack on to her question. I see she's added in the chat that some of the issues you've mentioned might overlap with those of the section manager. So maybe you could comment on that as well, Fred.
Yeah, that sounds great. All right, let me start with the last part of your question first, Betsy. What this is about is trying to bring people together and use the team that we have to solve problems. The section staff is an integral part of solving all of these problems, as are club leaders and individual hams here in New Hampshire. My role in this process is to do two things, is to create a forum and an active conversation and promote that to get everybody that has a hand in solving these problems to work together and actually create programs that will solve them. Okay, so this is about not moving around who's responsible. This is about getting everybody on the court and getting them work together. Okay. Now, your specific question about the role of the board. I've had a lot of experience on industry boards, both from the standpoint of being a board member and being a leader that's directly accountable to a board. So I've kind of seen both sides of this movie. The board should not be interfering with the CEO doing their job, and particularly hiring decisions absolutely need to be made by the CEO, not by the board. We've had some notable situations where we did it the other way, and they have not been good results. Okay, so I am a very strong believer that if you have an operational leader like a CEO, you need to set standards for their performance and goals. You need to set a tone that encourages them to be innovative and find better ways to do things. You need to hold them accountable, and then you need to stay the heck out of the way. And what I would say to the board is, if you're micromanaging the organization, who's doing your job? Who's working on the bigger issues that you should be tackling? Who's trying to get the resources in place so that the field staff and the staff in Newington has what they need to do an excellent job? That's the role of the board, not running the day-to-day organization. I have looked at the org chart, Betsy. There are two probably of the most key jobs in Newington open right now: Director of IT and Public Relations and Outreach Manager. These are both critical people in taking the ARRL forward. You know, we're going to talk a little bit about Logbook of the World and some of the computing services that the ARRL provides. Without a strong director of IT, those situations will not improve. They will not get solved. So that is, in my mind, a critical hire. Also, we're going to talk a lot about how we get public support and young people and new people involved in amateur radio. And I can't think of a role on that org chart that's more important to that than the person in charge of public relations and outreach. Okay. It's very important that the board provide adequate financial resources to the CEO so he can hire top-notch candidates for those two positions, because they are going to be key in solving our problems. Okay,
thank you, Fred.
Back to you. Yep.
So our next question comes from Stu Solomon, W1SHS from Franklin, Massachusetts. Stu asks, there's been a common perception that the current and past boards have taken to micromanaging the ARRL's affairs, both from day-to-day operations to more global matters. Perception is the board has not allowed the senior ARRL staff, including the CEO, to be allowed to do the job they were hired to do without unnecessary overreach. Do you agree with this perception? And if so, how would you, as a single board member, seek to change this ingrained behavior by the board? And this is actually very similar to a question that Frank, WQ10 from the Cape asks. He asks, is excessive board involvement in executive matters responsible for staff turnover in Newington?
Yep, great questions, by the way, folks. Thanks, Stu and Frank. As I said before, no, I don't believe the board should be involved in day-to-day operations. I can really relate to this. As an executive leader, I was a chief technology officer and in charge of strategy at a startup. And I had board members that very much wanted to actively play a role in those decisions. And so my challenge was to get them to provide the right advice and share their experience without actually trying to do my job. And it was very, very challenging, and unfortunately slowed things down, because in addition to spending time solving the problems we were supposed to solve, we had to spend time explaining the details of why we were doing what we're doing, and kind of keeping the board playing the proper role and be in a respectful way. So I can very much relate to this problem. Yes, I do believe that the board needs to do their job, and they need to let the CEO and their team do their job. The other problem with that kind of micromanagement is that it discourages the CEO and the staff from taking the risks and having the breathing room to find better ways to do things. You know, if you have somebody who's that you view as very senior to you, your boss's boss, if you will, which is kind of the role I think maybe the board looks to some of the people that are on the staff, and you see that they're watching your every move, you're sure not going to take much risk. You're sure not going to take and try and improve something if you don't think it's what those people want. And I think it creates a very negative environment for the kind of innovation we need to modernize the hobby and modernize the operations. How will I solve this across the board? The same way that I'm going to do other things. I'm going to be talking to my fellow board members and leaders about this. I'm going to be sharing my experience from being both sides of the fence, and I'm going to be trying my darndest to convince people that we need to focus it the right way in working with people. And I believe that there are quite a few board members that feel the same way. The folks that I've spoken with so far, many of them are of the same mind that you all are. And I think that a lot of this comes down to getting behind our CEO and giving them the chance to do the job they were hired to do. Okay, I think Larry, I believe you got the next set of questions.
Sounds good, and great answer so far, Fred. So we have a couple of questions from three hams that are all very similar. First one is from Pi Pew, K1RV in Abington, Mass. If elected, how would you propose to change the public perception about the ARRL board governments? And how would you prevent good ideas from rank and file members from simply being ignored?
Yeah, great questions. And Pi, Peter, and John, thank you for these questions. So I really believe this is about honest, responsive, two-way feedback and communications and accountability. So you should expect your director to listen to you, to make sure they understand what your concerns are, and that they're spending their time working on all the problems that you feel are important. I also think candor in communications is really important to build credibility. And the reason that I believe some folks distrust the ARRL is that the leaders have not had the ability or the comfort maybe of displaying the level of candor about what's really going on, what the problems are, and what they're trying to do to fix them that we need. I will not do that. Those of you who know my style know that I speak my mind. There may be some rules that I have to follow as a director, and I certainly have to respect the integrity of the process in the board and not compromise it. And there are some good guidelines there, but that doesn't mean that we can't be open and listen to you and take your input into the process and make sure it gets heard and gets listened to. I honestly believe that effective communications is a heck of a lot more about listening than talking and outward communications. I think one of the other mistakes that many organizations and some leaders make is that they believe as long as they tell everybody what's going on, they're good. And that is not in any way, shape, or form what having good communications and candor is about. It's mostly about listening and acting. Some of the stuff I mentioned earlier about taking your feedback and reading it out at the beginning of my board meetings and using that to set the stage is an example of how you generate real two-way communications and how we build your trust that the process is speaking for all of you as the members. You all get a chance to tell us if you like this town hall at the end. If you did, you have my commitment that we'll hold plenty more of these while I'm in office. This is a great way for us to get input and a great way for us to stand up and be responsive to what your concerns are and talk about what we're going to try to do to help. So back to you, Larry.
Okay, great. Bob Lobley, W1BOB asks, the ARRL just got a new CEO. Are you familiar with him? And what, if any, changes do you see or anticipate under his leadership?
Yeah, great question, Bob. Thank you for that. I've been watching David pretty closely, and I like what I see so far. I'm going to relate this to you in my own context. I spent quite a bit of time as a general manager running a large division in the telecom company. It was about a $380 million a year business that had over 750 employees worldwide. So I have a little bit of a feel for what it takes to do David's job. Now, David actually has some more significant experience than I do. But in looking at his background, he has the right mix of real operational experience, strategic planning skills. It looks like he has a sound model for managing people and encouraging them to take risks and innovate. And particularly David's focus on strategy and planning are super important roles for the ARRL CEO to exhibit right now. I've done a lot of strategic planning work myself, and I know that it is the way through very tough business and other organizational problems. I also am very encouraged to see that he reached out and made it a priority to reach out to all the section managers. I think that demonstrates that he cares about what people around him think and he's looking for input. I also starting to see a little more open communication under his watch by some of the people on his staff. And I think that's also extremely positive. His background is not tremendously dissimilar from mine. I think we'll probably have a lot of common ground to work together on. And I look forward to having that opportunity to engage him in this new role and work directly with him. I believe he'll be an ally.
Thank you, Fred. And I think that explains a lot.
All righty, thanks, Larry. Let's go over to Rob. And Rob, do you want to ask a few questions here?
All right. Well, good evening. I'll bring these two questions kind of grouped together from Ron Wood, KB1WGN from Caribou, Maine, and Frank O'Laughlin, WQ10 of Marston's Mills, Mass. The two questions are, one's kind of specific and one's kind of more general in the same vein. I want to know your thoughts on ARES and how you feel about the future after the ARES Connect attempt. Many of the main ARES teams quit. That was from Roy, KB1WGN. And kind of a follow-up that's broader, but kind of related. What will you do to address the lack of emergency communication policies and the lack of field organization participation in determining them? And that's from Frank WQ.
All right. Well, thank you, Roy and Frank. You know, emergency communications and public service work is a really important part of the amateur radio service for a number of reasons. First of all, and most importantly, it is the number one way we build public support and recognition for what we do as amateur radio people. And without that public recognition and support, we are going to lose a lot of our privileges and a lot of our ability to use spectrum. And more importantly, the public is going to lose out on the opportunity to have access to very broadly distributed, very well-trained people that can pick up in places and in emergencies where everything else goes south. And I can tell you, having worked on some of the alternatives, I developed cellular systems for many years in my life. The rest of the public infrastructure, as good as it is, can and will fail, can and will be the victim of cyber attacks, and can and will be always subject to overload and destruction and disasters. And so it's very, very important that we bring our work in emergency communications and all that goes into it forward, and that we have good engagement with the agencies that we're trying to serve so that they appreciate what we can do and they build us into their plans. Now, I took it as a very good sign that the league formed a standing committee. A standing committee at the ARRL is a big deal. They just formed an emergency communications public service and public service committee. And I think that it's going to be, I think the actual title is Emergency Communications Field Services Committee, just to be correct there. And I think that it's going to be very, very important that we pay close attention to what that committee does, and we involve New England people in formulating the end result. So Here's what I would say. I believe that New England has some of the strongest capabilities of any division for emergency communication. The ARRL community here is very strong. The NTS community is amazing. And we have a lot of very dedicated Skywarn people, such as you, Rob, spend untold amounts of your time doing a very professional job of dealing with what is increasingly a very difficult and dangerous weather situations that we constantly face. One of the things I'm going to do, first of all, I'm going to try to get myself on this committee, but one thing I can guarantee I can do is I can audit their meetings, and I will audit every single one of the meetings, and I will look for opportunities to suggest and involve New England folks in ARRL, NTS, and other emergency service work in the working processes in those committees to give you all a voice. I'm also planning to appoint an assistant director that's going to focus on this area to try to bring some of the great functionality that's here. For example, many of the individual sections have good databases of trained people who are able to help in emergencies. It would be great if we could find a way to unify those databases into a New England-wide resource, and in the process, carry that information into the working process as a model to begin sorting through replacing ARRL Connect. I think on the specific issue of ARRL Connect, that was a great example of the perfect being the enemy of the good. It is essential that we have a tool like ARRL Connect so that we know who the trained professionals are when we have an emergency, that we know the kinds of activities that are being done, that we can demonstrate to public agencies of how we're becoming prepared and skilled at doing this work. And I think it's an absolute shame that ARRL Connect was taken down. I believe it should be a top priority of this committee that we're talking about to find a good replacement for ARRL Connect and get it in place as quickly as possible. Also, there is an opening for a director of emergency management. I believe that's a key hire for the CEO. And when that hire is made, I look forward to engaging that individual and helping the people here in New England who care so much about this work to engage as well, so that we can shape that his or her policy for taking emergency services and all that goes with it forward. And this stuff is really important. And I know it's extremely important to a lot of people here in New England. All right, back to you, Rob, for another question.
All right, excellent. Next question is from KC1HHO, Peter Doherty. If Peter's on, good evening to Peter. I know him as well. Although the ARRL provides many resources related to the National Traffic System information on the ARRL website, the ARRL's overall commitment to the program is lacking attention. Improvements regarding standardized training and programs, special events, contests recognized by ARRL are long overdue and non-existent. What can you do as a director to foster growth of NTS?
Yeah, great question. By the way, I've had the privilege of getting a chance to meet and interact with a lot of the folks in the NTS community. And I must say that the level of professionalism and training and dedication to what the NTS community does, despite the weak support that you're getting, is just awesome. It's amazing. I think if I had to find a group of people who would work to train and make any activity in New England a professional endeavor, this might be the first place I'd go to ask for help. Okay. I also believe that having a traffic system for emergency communications and other needs is an essential part of should be an essential part of the ARRL's communications and emergency services strategy going forward. I'd like to see someone that's a leader in the NTS community here in New England be appointed to a working group spawned off by the Emergency Communications and Field Services Committee, and I will work to try to make that happen. I don't believe that there is any division that has people more qualified to define the future and the role that NTS plays as a pillar in our emergency communication strategy than the people here in New England. Back to you, Rob.
All right, excellent answer there as well. And the final question here is from Steve Schwarm, W3EVE in Rentham, Mass. If Steve's on, good evening. Another a person I know well. Steve is concerned about the ARRL's lack of national emergency planning around hurricanes and other large events. We need to have a plan in place with a well-defined procedure for qualified MCOM volunteers to get involved. So he didn't, that was the statement. It's kind of statements, but I think he's looking for your
input or thoughts on it. Yep, we got it. Thank you, Steve. By the way, this is the biggest no-brainer in the history of emergency communications. All one has to do is look at the weather reports over the last 3 or 4 years, and you can pretty easily figure out that hurricanes and major weather events are the #1 emergency threat that we face in the United States on a regular basis. I think that this should be the top priority for the next director of emergency management to address. In other words, this one ought to be at the head of the line. It's something that we use constantly, that we face constantly. And I think that, and I would be honestly, quite frankly, quite surprised if it didn't work out that way. It just seems to me completely obvious that this is the most important way that we can and already are providing real assistance in emergencies. Again, I think part of the way we're going to do this, and I know Phil is of the same mind here as I am, we are going to work very hard in the internal process in the ARRL to inject members of New England that are doing Skywarn work and want to help with these problems into the process. And we're going to make sure that once we know who our director of emergency management is, that we sit down with that person and we spend some serious time on and make sure that they understand what the priorities are as far as we're concerned. Okay. Thank you, Rob. All right, let's go over to Corey. Corey, do you want to tee up the next series of questions?
Absolutely. Christopher N1CAK from Vineyard Haven, Mass. asks, how can the ARRL help us to get information out about licensed classes and VE sessions? How can we get this information in front of young people?
Great question, and something that is very near and dear to my heart. So a little bit of background on this one. My club has been teaching licensed classes pretty steadily for the last 5 years. We teach a tech, a general, and extra class every spring and every fall. And we teach 1 to 2 dedicated tech classes for middle and high school students every year. I can tell you that the ARRL has some good resources to publicize classes. If you go to arrl.org/list a license class, and you publicize there, you will find you'll get a good response to your classes. That's the main way that we publicize our classes. And for those doing VE sessions, I'm sure many of you know this, but you can register your testing sessions at arrl.org, register an amateur radio license exam session. And that's also a great way to publicize your work. So what about young people? They're probably not looking at the ARRL website that much yet. Most of them probably don't have licenses at this point. I will tell you that the prime vehicle for reaching young people is going to be social media. Okay. And this is going to kind of lead us into some other issues about communications and so on here in a minute. But we as a community need to get really good at using social media if we are going to reach out effectively to younger people and to students and so on in New Hampshire. Facebook and Twitter and other outlets like that, YouTube is particularly important, as is Instagram for certain situations, are absolutely the thing that these folks watch. And we need to be publicizing our classes and our VE sessions and the other things we're doing on youth outreach in those places. I think that we should develop some training courses. The ARRL has a role to play there, and I believe we as a division have a role to play there as well. There are some people, some clubs and some groups here that are very good at this stuff already. I hope to bring those people together through the work of the assistant directors and my own work to provide some training materials for everybody else in the division to pull up. Also, I found out that I'm going to have a budget, and I think that if we can get these things on social media, we should be using some of that budget for Facebook advertising to make sure that we reach as many young people and people who would be interested in becoming hams as we possibly can. Also, clubs' relationships with teachers and educators can often, if asked, get a presence on the school's Facebook pages. I've done that multiple times in the schools that I've been involved in. And again, if we're trying to do licensing work, especially when we develop a age-appropriate licensing class, those are great ways for us to reach the right audience in a way that they want to be reached. Okay.
Okay, Lemuel W1LEM in Brewster, Mass. states, I see a lot of publicity of club and section events and news on the internal websites, but I rarely see anything in the general media, social, print, or broadcast. How can such events be supported at the division level? We seem to talk to ourselves a lot. Fred, can you please address Lemuel's
Yeah,
concern?
great question, Lem. That's a super question. Again, I think a lot of the key to this is to do stuff effectively on social media. I would like to see us have a strong presence for this stuff on a division level social media page, on the ARRL pages, on my ARRL voice. There are already a club Facebook pages and so on. Social media is extremely powerful, especially with younger people. And when I say younger, I think younger, we could probably define in this context as 40 and under. And so being very, very good at publicizing the work your club is doing, license class, all the stuff we've been talking about on social media will definitely up the game significantly. I mentioned earlier in response to Betsy's question on the org chart that one of the critical hires was the public relations and outreach manager, and the position underneath it in particular, which is titled social media strategist. It's a very good sign that the league gets that having somebody who's a specialist in social media is an important part of this. And again, I believe we need to support the CEO with resources for salary and so on to let them get very high grade individuals for these jobs. They're going to be critical ones. And again, I think the other part of the question would be kind of national media. Involvement in schools, working on programs like ARRL, which almost always receive television coverage when they happen, are great ways that we can step up our game in kind of conventional regional and national level media. And again, I think having some sort of training material, which we could easily create by working together here in the division, to help clubs figure out how to approach that problem would be work well done. And I would definitely support doing it if people want to engage. Okay, back to you, Corey.
Hey, you grouped me in that younger ham group, 40 or under. I just made it. So that's the nicest thing I've heard all day. All
There
right,
you go.
Greg W1USA in Oxford, Mass. writes, I'm concerned by the lack of effectiveness of the ARRL in protecting our HF bands from being made unusable by interference from electric utilities. Does the ARRL not want us to bother them or the utility companies with complaints? There is no directory showing how to file a complaint, and large utilities like National Grid and Eversource are not easy to navigate. Fred, your response?
Yeah, Greg, great question. And one that's personal for me. I'm finding this issue in my own station right now. I've spent a great deal of effort and resources to build a really solid DX and contesting station. And on many of the bands, I can't even operate without a noise blanker anymore. Okay, so I can absolutely relate to this. Here's what I can tell you about this. What makes this problem difficult is it's not just one thing that's causing it. The sources of QRM on the HF band or the power infrastructure, as you called out, I think, well, I know in my own situation, and I know others, but solar power equipment that's becoming so popular is a major source of this problem. LED lighting, particularly imported LED lighting, and all the different things it's used for are also a major source. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to attack this on multiple fronts at once. And we're going to need to get the ARRL to help us. So what does that look like? First of all, I think that some work by the lab to characterize the different types of interference so that hams can understand when they see something on their on the bands, they have an idea of what they're even looking at, is an important first step. I think we have to have some work done on processes that we can follow to isolate it. Unfortunately, it'd be nice to say that we could just complain and there would be an army of people that would come rushing out to find our source of interference for us. It's probably not going to work that way. We're going to have to do some work to track down where it's coming from. Fortunately, the techniques to do that work are not always all that difficult, and I think we could use some training on that front. And then lastly, and this is probably a really important one, we need to work with the FCC to enforce Part 15, pure and simple. Part 15 covers emissions, RF emissions from anything that ends up in a consumer environment, which would cover the LED lights, the solar power, and so on. I spent quite a bit of time as a member of the FCC Technical Advisory Committee. That group was responsible for working directly with the FCC on technical policy related to wireless services. And I can tell you from my experience on the TAC that this is an opportunity for us because the cellular operators are suffering from a lot of the same problems on the higher bands that we're suffering from on HF. And so I believe that the ARRL and its role on the TAC needs to basically work with the cellular operators and put some pressure on the FCC to get the Part 15 part of this better enforced. And you know, all we need is a couple good examples of the FCC coming down hard on people who are selling products that are not compliant. That will go a long way to settle this stuff down. So I also believe that the division has a role to play here. We have an excellent website, and I think we can put information there on how to contact various power companies, where to go for information on isolating RFI problems, and make that a resource that we can all use to work through this. Okay. All right, let's go back over to Larry for some more questions.
Okay, we have two hams with similar questions. One is by Daryl, KB1KXJ in Merrimack, New Hampshire, and the other is by Peter, KD2JKV in Pittsfield, Mass. And the two questions are, how do we encourage more ham educators in the schools? And how do we get ham radio back into the schools? Our hobby is really what STEM is all about.
Yeah, great one. STEM, by the way, for those of you who may not know, stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. It's a major push. And there's also something called STEAM, which is similar. That is a major push to bring technical disciplines, education, and career choices to young people, okay? First of all, the ARRL has some great programs that can help in this area. There's something called the ARRL's Teachers Institute that is made available to teachers to come and learn about amateur radio, learn about electronics, and most importantly, learn how to use amateur radio to facilitate STEM learning in their schools. I've worked with several teachers who have been through this program, and they all seem to be coming away as well motivated to follow through in their classrooms. I think that we could do a better job of making teachers aware of these opportunities. I also would like to see it opened up somehow to homeschooling situations. Obviously, the delivery format needs to be a little bit different, but I believe homeschooling is a fertile ground for engaging young people in these kinds of STEM learning opportunities. I think clubs can do a great job, as I have been doing with my club, to bring STEM learning into schools. It takes investment, and it takes an attitude that's maybe a little different than what might seem to be the obvious one. You know, if you approach a teacher and you say, give me some of your classroom time, I want to talk about amateur radio, you're likely to get a pretty blank stare. At least I've always gotten a pretty blank stare when I've done that. But if you go to a teacher and say, what are you teaching in your math and science classes right now? Well, we're teaching wave theory, and we're talking about physics, and we're talking about physical properties and so on. And then you go back and you think about how could amateur radio be applied to what they're already teaching? And you go back to that teacher and say, you know, how about we consider, you know, talking about the electromagnetic spectrum as it relates to radio waves and where amateur radio fits in. And maybe we do a demonstration of how radio communications can be used to facilitate the technology that we all use. That's how you bring yourself into a school situation and become a partner with the teacher. And once you do that, it becomes, if you stay at it over time, possible to get significant amounts of classroom time dedicated to actually teaching STEM through amateur radio. I'm involved in at least 3 local schools where we routinely get significant amount of time. One school is allowing me to teach amateur radio for credit as an elective. That's a middle school. Another local middle school, the teachers there that have been through the Teachers Institute are licensed amateur radio operators, and they're teaching amateur radio in their classrooms with people that are hams sitting in the classroom backing them up with activities. So it takes investment. It takes a mindset that says you're going to build amateur radio to be a supplement to what the school's already teaching. And this is, again, a key role that clubs can play, and is one of the reasons that I'm planning to dedicate an assistant director specifically to this problem.
Excellent, excellent. The next question comes from my longtime friend Carol Gall, W1LGU in East Hampton, Mass. I saw the photos of the scholarship winners in QST this month. I noticed glaringly the very little diversity in winners, a few Asian Americans and possibly one or two others, no Black or other people of color. Would you be willing to make some effort to help clubs and the ARRL make more of an effort to recruit and mentor more diverse populations, especially the young, and find a way to involve them actively in ham radio? I think it could serve to enhance our hobby and make it more inclusive.
Yep, absolutely. You know, I've spent a lot of times in school, and I see what the next generation of the amateur radio community has to look like if we're going to survive. It's right there in front of you in every classroom you step into. So what do you see? What kids are interested in STEM learning technology? Well, in the classrooms I've been in, it's usually at least half to 3/4 young women. It's usually more males who are non-Caucasian than are Caucasian, okay? And if we don't restructure or kind of work to make amateur radio look like that population, how do we ever expect to appeal to them? This is a really important issue, and it's not easy to do from where we're starting from. So how do we go about doing that? First of all, every club that I know of has YLs, folks who are minorities that want to be involved in amateur radio. We need to put those people in the front of the charge. We need to groom them for leadership roles on club boards, be part of VE teams, class teams, field day leaders. Anything where somebody is out front is a good opportunity to groom a young woman or a lady or a minority member to be a leader in your club. Take a look at your website. What does a minority or a woman see when they look at your presence? Do they see other folks like them having fun with amateur radio? You know, you got to walk this talk if you're serious about it. I'm a big believer that the way you can truly tell if somebody believes in something is if they're actually doing what they're talking about, not just talking about it, okay? And by the way, the folks that we're trying to appeal to here are looking at all of us to see if we're walking this talk, okay? The ARRL has work to do. We don't see a lot of graphics on the ARRL website right now, but where we do see it on Facebook pages and stuff, there's work to be done there too. And particularly your presence on social media is the #1 places where you have your chance to demonstrate what you're about or what we're about as an amateur radio community. And so, yes, I think this is very, very important. Some suggestions. We have a young a lady, her name is Abby, her call sign's AB1BY, that we put on our board as a youth advisor. And we listen to Abby constantly. Abby teaches license classes. Abby's at the front of almost all of our training. You'll see her at boot camp. These are examples of what you need to do if you're really serious about engaging folks in these groups. And it will make a world of difference. And by the way, we don't have to solve the whole problem on our own, but if we demonstrate that we're welcoming participation by a diverse group of hams, you will find that you'll be rewarded, I think, with a lot of new hams who want to be part of your group and your team.
Very good. And I think you've sort of answered the next two questions about YLs and young hams for Barbara, KC1, KGS, and Eric KB1EHE. You covered pretty much both of those with the first question, so I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right,
you.
I do have one more thing I want to say. So in the spirit of walking the talk, I very much want to see some of my assistant directors be in from these groups. That's going to be a top priority. If we can put that kind of person in front at the division leadership, maybe that'll help encourage clubs and others to do the same in their realm. And I think that would be a very positive step. All right, Rob, I think it's back to you for some more questions.
Yes, it is. And this first question is from K1ILR, Fran Walsh, Melrose, Mass. If Fran is on, I'll say good evening to him. Hope all is well. His question is, what specific things have you done already or are now hoping to do, which would focus on attracting more of the 50-plus-year-old, in parentheses, ARP type crowd, and the recently retired? Do you have an outreach plan, a hope, or a direction specifically to lead us and suggest how we all can make more effective investments of time and energy in the older citizens for growing our ham community of service?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, in terms of bringing new people into the hobby, in my mind, this is what you would call low-hanging fruit. Senior hams are probably going to be the most likely to be happy and comfortable with amateur radio as it is today. Okay, they have time. Many of them have financial resources and are looking for something to do with their senior years. So this is very fertile ground for us. I am working, so on the question of what am I doing now, I'm working on some outreach to one group that is engaged at a senior center to see if I can get my club to teach a license class at the senior center. That would be an excellent way to begin here for many clubs. Also approaching senior centers and senior community leaders with the opportunities to talk about amateur radio and some of the things that amateur radios do, make some friends, pay some attention to the people in those settings are great ways to engage these communities, I think. Also, clubs have a key role to play here in mentoring seniors, helping them get on the air, helping them put a station together, get antennas up and the like. So yeah, I think there's fertile opportunity here. And I think the ARRL again could do some great work here to promote these kinds of activities that we will be doing as clubs amongst senior groups in an attempt to get them more traction. And I believe they'll do that. I had conversations with fairly senior people on the staff in Newington, and I know they get this. I know they get this. Rob, back to you.
All right, and then this next question is from K1OYB, Marty Feeney in Scarborough, Maine. Marty's on, good evening. Can the league provide any assistance to aging amateurs who need tower and antenna installation and maintenance?
Yeah, hi, Marty. This is a good question. You know, it's something that many of us worry about. I know I worry about this. I've got a lot of pretty heavy duty antenna equipment here, and I wonder how I'm going to maintain it in another 20 years or so. You know, there are some good professionals around, and I know that these folks will attempt, although many of them are not inexpensive, folks like Mark Pride, K1RX, Matt Strelo, KC1XX, to give seniors a break. And I think we should continue to do that. The problem is that many senior folks find themselves in the dually difficult situation where they love amateur radio, they need maintenance on their stations, but they don't have the financial resources available to hire professionals to do the work for them. Again, I believe this is an excellent club outreach and mentoring opportunity. And I think many clubs would find this to be a very natural thing to do, to go out and help people that need some help in maintaining the stations and keeping them on the air. So I would like to see this be a major focus for our ham development assistant director, as well as a major focus for me. And I believe the division website could be a resource. If clubs are willing to volunteer to do this outreach work, we ought to create a directory where the seniors who need the help can find them. Okay. All right, thanks, Rob. Phil, let's go back to you for a few more questions. And then I think maybe after this round, we might take a little break here and go for some of the online questions that are live here, because I see they're piling up. But Phil, go ahead and do your next round of questions here, then we'll deal with them. We got some tough ones here.
Thanks, Fred. Yes, this next question comes from my friend Bill Ricker in 1VUX in Dorchester, Mass. Bill asks, why should New England ARRL members vote for someone with no ARRL field appointments in their ham resume for ARRL New England Division Director?
So Bill, first of all, thank you for asking a hard question. I think it's important for any leader to be able to deal with concerns that are not easy ones. Okay, so with that, first of all, what's my experience? I have a very diverse set of experience in amateur radio. I've done many, many different things. No, I do not have any field service appointments in my resume. But let me tell you what I do have in my resume and a little bit of why it's important. You know, I've led groups of people through some pretty tough problems in my working life. And every time I've done that, the thing that's allowed me to succeed is having a team around me of people whose strengths complemented mine and whose my strengths have complemented theirs. So look around at who's on this panel. I think you're going to see that there are some tremendously experienced people here that are already working with me that have years and years and years of field service experience, that are actively involved in important field service work. You know, Phil, who's asking the question here, probably has more experience than 5 other people put together will ever have, okay? So let me tell you what I bring to this puzzle. I know how to motivate people to get to work together and get things done, and I know how to make change happen. I've done this through my whole professional life. It's what I'm known for. And I think the situation that we face right now with amateur radio screams out for people who can create effective change and can create it quickly. You know, the problems that you all have been raising here are all the right ones, and there's a lot of work to be done. And it's going to take a very broadly focused team that can tackle not just one thing at a time or one issue, but can tackle all this stuff at once. My commitment as a leader is to build a team through my assistant directors, the field staff, and our process around these town halls and my board, where we are actively going to work on and solve problems. And what I'm going to bring to that equation is a couple things. First of all, I know how to make change happen and build people to align around it. And I think we desperately need that both inside the ARRL and here in New England. Secondly, those who know me know that I have almost unlimited energy. I often joke that I can't wait to go back to work and rest. And I pretty much work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day on nothing but amateur radio now. And I'll share a little bit at the end of why I feel so strongly about this work. Okay. I also expect that some of my assistant directors will come from the field organization. I'm almost guaranteed that, okay? So this is not about having just a set of people who have kind of come up through the ARRL structure. Those skills and knowledge are important because we got to get stuff done in the environment that we have. And it's well organized and it does a lot of things well. And wherever we can, we're going to use that environment, but we're also going to supplement it with some leaders who are going to try to bring people together in a broader setting across multiple sections. We're going to get the clubs actively involved in being part of the solution, and we're going to do stuff and solve problems. Anybody who knows my track record in business with the National ARRL Radio Society and anything else knows that that's going to happen. Okay. I'd also point out that that someone with executive leadership and real board experience has a huge asset in this role. Okay. We're all concerned about the role the board plays, the role the CEO plays. What better person to put in that position who's somebody who's worked in their professional life in those roles and know how to get things done and make progress. So Bill, thanks for asking a hard question. I hope you got a good answer to your question. All right, how about the next one? Phil.
Thank you, Fred. And let me just add, I'm very pleased to hear that you're going to have a full and active cabinet of people assisting you.
I don't
Next
see how we
question.
get anything done without that.
Next question comes from Lem, W1LEM and Brewster, and I'll combine it with a question from Greg, WA1JXR in Lancaster, Massachusetts. They're very similar. Lem asks, the technician exam requires the student to study a lot of material that may not be of interest to young people. Do you think it would be advisable to redesign the exam to focus on what a new ham needs to know to get started, instead of focusing on what old guys think kids should have to learn because they had to learn it 40 years ago? And then Greg asks, why can't we and the ARRL lobby the FCC for a new entry-level novice class license with a small question pool and perhaps provide for 2-meter FM privileges? This can get young people into the hobby when they can learn as they get on the air, converse with other hams, and join local ham clubs.
Yep. Lem and Greg, great questions. And, you know, a big part of what I've spent my time on is licensing over the last 5 years. And I've had enough experience of actually not just testing people, but also actually teaching people through classes the material that they need to know to pass these exams to have a pretty well-formed opinion on this. Let me give you a statistics. Did you know that best case, only 25% of the people that get a technician license today will be active and on the air a year later? Some people think that number is more like 15%. Okay. And you know, because we've touched almost 200 people now, and we do a lot of sort of follow-up with folks to understand what happens to them after we help them earn their license. Let me tell you what goes on there. First of all, the number one reason that young people and new hams don't get active is they don't have enough access to mentoring. That's one of the reasons that I'm pushing the idea of really stepping up the mentoring activity so hard. There are literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, probably tens of thousands, an accurate number, out there that already have licenses, at least technicians, that would get on the air if somebody just helped them to do that. So let's look at the barriers now that you all are asking about, which is how do we get people started? You know, we've done some work on what I call an age-appropriate licensing program. It's the reason that we teach 1 or 2 school student-oriented tech classes every year. So when we have a group of middle school kids or high school kids, we're getting ready to do another one for one of my ARRL schools that's down in New York. We do a special class for them, and we teach it differently than we teach it for, you know, sort of the average rank and file. If you teach those classes correctly, it is not difficult at all for a young person to get a tech, a general. We've even licensed some folks as young as 10 years old, all the way to extra. This is not about the difficulty of the exam. It's about teaching it in the proper way and not flooding the poor student with a lot of things they don't need to know to get licensed and on the air, and then following through with excellent mentoring to help them learn to be great hams. Secondly, the number one thing I see happen is people get all psyched, young people get all psyched to get a tech license. They get it, they get on the local repeater, they put up their call sign and nobody talks to them. And then they also realize that to make a contact, you know, to another state or another country in the world, they need to get another license. So imagine you being, you know, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 years old and finding that out. You're probably at a pause point for your amateur radio career when that happens. You're going to ask, is it worth it to go back through again? And especially given that nobody particularly helped me to use my first license, and I'm not even sure what you know, I'm going to have much fun with it if they do. So here's a place where I think the ARRL has got this partly right. The ARRL looked at all of these issues and they decided that the best thing that they could do would be to lobby the FCC to add meaningful HF band privileges to the technician license. I personally think that's the right first step. And here's what that'll do. First of all, it will motivate the folks who have techs now or who get a tech to actually have a much richer on-the-air experience and get active. And that is the number one thing we have to do with any license that we create or any changes we make here, if we're going to actually get people not only to get licensed, but to actually become active hams, okay? Here's my specific answer to both your questions. I think we need to work to create an age-appropriate licensing program that all the clubs in New England can use. That's going to be a top priority for me when I get into office. We're going to make that happen. I also think we need to get the amateur radio community aligned around the FCC following through on meaningful HF band privileges for the tech license. That not only will motivate people to get licenses, but more important, that some 75% of the people who got one that never used it will probably start using those licenses too. And that will have a huge immediate impact. Now, all that may not be enough. So what we have to do, and the ARRL has a role to play here, we need to be collecting data from the people after we make these changes that have these licenses to see what we did, to see if we can actually see if we're solving the problem, if we're on the right track. Let's say that we find out that we aren't. Then we can talk about creating a novice class license or a new license that's better tuned to solve the problem. But without the information that we have on what the people that are getting the licenses we have now want, what their blockers are, I'm not sure we know what kind of license to create yet. Okay. The other thing I will tell you is the process to do this at the FCC will likely take years. Till we define it, the FCC goes through their processes, get it into their systems. We update all the training materials, the VE processes, and everything else. It will take a long time to create a new license. And before we walk down that road, I think we should focus on the short-term steps that I just outlined, because they are definitely going to help. And they will give us the data that if we do decide we need another license class, that we understand exactly what we're trying to create there, so we can go through and invest all that time and money and effort in the right thing. Okay. All right. Let's see. I think we've covered most of this stuff now. There's a few questions left, which we can come back to at the end. But before we do that, I see there's a lot of questions in the online. Phil, do you want to maybe throw some of these out, and let's see if we can answer some things real time here?
Sure, I'll take a stab at one. I'm going to skip over a few because you've addressed them pretty well, I think. But here's one from Wolfgang Wendler, K1WR, and he asks, Fred, will you be interested in strengthening HAM's rights to build meaningful antenna structures in HOA situations?
Absolutely. I obviously amateur radio is all about the antenna. Without access to a good antenna, you're not ever going to have a very meaningful amateur radio experience. Yes, absolutely. But I think that the key thing that we need to do, and the thing that I'm going to try to do first, is we need to build better public support and awareness for what amateur radio can bring. Let me give you an example of what that can look like. I did an ARRS amateur radio on the International Space Station at a local middle school here, where we went through a one-year program in that school to bring amateur radio into the school, teach the kids about wireless technology and all that it brings, help the kids build a radio, put together a radio station, and they talked to an astronaut on the space station while some 400 people, including all their parents, all of the teachers, the school board, the superintendent, and several town officials stood there and watched and cheered. That's how you build support for legislation. That's how you get bills passed. So if we're serious about actually creating meaningful HOA legislation, and there are lots of great people out there who know how to write these bills, but we're not going to get any of these bills passed and into law unless we build public support and awareness for amateur radio. Now, I can tell you that contact took place in the town of Hudson, and if we wanted to get an HOA bill in front of the town council there, I guarantee I could get 50 parents to come to that town council meeting and lobby for it. Okay. So what this is going to be about is not only writing legislation, that's important. And by the way, there's some people who believe we can throw lobbying dollars at this and fix it. If you look at the amount of money that the people that are fighting against this legislation have, you will know pretty quickly that amateur radio in the ARRL does not have the funds necessary to spend their way through lobbying and solve these problems. It is simply not going to work. Okay, there's a lot more money behind the opposition than there is around that the league has to spend here. Okay, it doesn't mean they shouldn't do lobbying. I think that's an important part of the solution, But if that's all we try and do, we're going to have lots of great bills like the great bills we have now that don't get passed. And so, yes, I think this is really important. It's a top reason that I want to put so much focus on public awareness and support for amateur radio so we could get some of this stuff done. More questions?
Good. Well, I'll ask you one more that's very similar, and it comes from Joe Grace, W1SK in Winslow, Maine. Joe asks, considering your statement earlier about the threats to our spectrum, what changes to the league's lobbying efforts in Washington and within the FCC and other avenues do you think could be beneficial to the league's members and the greater amateur community as a whole?
Yep. Well, I did talk about one relative to the HF interference issues and trying to build alliances with the cellular operators and the TAC, FCC TAC. I believe that would probably gain some ground. I know those people from my own experience working in the TAC would be concerned about that, and that would have an impact on the FCC. Beyond that, I really believe we need to build public support and have the pressure come through our elected officials. And by the way, a lot of good work should be done at the state level first. It's going to be a heck of a lot easier for us to get state level bills passed to provide opportunities for us to get antennas and HOAs and do reasonable things there than it's going to be to get federal level legislation passed. The level of money being spent on lobbying at the federal level is just phenomenal. It really is. Now, we also probably should be smart about where we spend the money and the resources we do have. But I do think that there's no substitute for public support for amateur radio. We will not get much done in this realm at all without that. And I really think we need to focus a heck of a lot more energy on that front. The ARRL needs to do that, and we as individual hams need to do that through the work that we do. Okay.
Thank you, Fred.
All right. Let's see. We're getting pretty close to the end here. I just have a couple things that are left in the question pool here. Corey, I'm going to do these two real quick just so that we can answer everybody's questions that came in. There was a concern raised by Stu, W1SHS, about Logbook of the World being fragile and being underfunded. I agree with that assessment. I think it's right. Again, as I mentioned, we need to have a well-qualified head of IT hired, and we need to let that person be responsible and charge them with solving this problem. And the board basically needs to stay out of the way. Also, I know some folks, Elliot raised a question about COVID safety at Ham Exposition. You'll be happy to know that Phil and I both sit on the Ham Exposition board, and we've been working on making sure that Ham Exposition this year has a coherent COVID policy. We're proud to report to you that that policy is in place and published on the website. You could go check it out at hamexposition.org. All right, we have a few minutes left here. Phil, is there anything else? Maybe we have probably time for one more question, and I should go to the wrap up.
Let's see. Mr. Mike, W1RC from Marblehead, Massachusetts, asks a question that you may have covered previously, but let me read it. I am particularly concerned by the total lack of effectiveness of the ARRL in protecting the HF bands from being made unusable by local interference carried by electric and other utility lines. The article in September 2021 QST was virtually useless in that it did not offer solutions.
Yeah.
We need a central database of the responsible officials at each power utility with email addresses and direct phone numbers. Will you address this situation if elected?
Absolutely. How about we start out, Mike, by creating one on the division website for New England? We could do that. That's a problem we could easily solve. But beyond that, I think, hopefully I covered some of the other pieces of this, the idea of working with the FCC to get Part 15 enforced, and having the lab folks in Newington develop some real tools that we could use to isolate and understand what kind of interference we're dealing with. I think it's a really important issue. I'm finding it here in my own station. Some of my bands are almost unusable here as well, so I got it. And we're going to work to fix that problem. And I think some of it we can fix locally, or at least improve locally here in New England. All right, let me, I have one slide that I kind of want to wrap up with here. And by the way, all of you, there will be a brief survey. I think it's only got 4 questions. where you can tell us about how effective we were here tonight, and also tell us if you think this was a useful process and we should continue it, as well as ask us or share with us any other thoughts or reactions you have. Please take a moment when the webinar here closes and do that survey. We need your feedback. So to sum up all of this stuff, here's fundamentally what I'm trying to do. I really want to promote and protect the amateur radio service as we all enjoy it today. This hobby is a wonderful hobby. In my mind, there's nothing else in the world that compares with it. And we need to do everything we can do to do that. And we need to be proactive about it. We can't just talk about the problems. We need to do things. I really believe that clubs and all of you, if we get a little bit innovative, can create a vibrant amateur radio service and solve some of these problems that we're talking about. And we can lead by example the rest of the ARRL in doing what they need to do to help us. I am not at all about just talking about the problems and acknowledge them. I think that's a pertinent first step, but we need action to actually solve them. We're starting to run out of time, particularly on topics like bringing new people in the hobby. If we don't get this soon, there's going to be a lot less of us here to do it. You know where I stand on positive public service, positive public support, and also from an MCOM point of view, agency support for amateur radio and how we're going to create it. And I really believe that real two-way transparent communication starts by doing a lot of listening and creating forums where people can say what's on their mind and have the leadership in the division address your concerns. So that's what we're doing here. And if you want us to keep doing it, we will make it an integral part of the process going forward. And lastly, I just want to share on a personal note. Folks have asked me, Fred, why do you want this job? What are you trying to do here? What's your motive? Well, for me, it's pretty simple. I think amateur radio changes lives. It changed my life. I grew up in a pretty poor setting where I probably would have never had any opportunity to lead anything had it not been for an uncle in my life who exposed me to amateur radio and electronics and got me started down this path. Now, where I grew up, it took a long time for me to actually get licensed, but it set me down the path to pursue everything I pursued in my professional life. And I really feel truly blessed as a result of that. And I know many of you have a story just like that. I've heard lots of them. The reason I want to do this, the reason I've done everything I've done in the Nashua Club and other places with ARRL and so on is very simple. I want to be your director so I can help all of you to make this kind of positive difference for as many people as we can. Because if even 10% of you do this, the outcome for amateur radio will be much more positive and very different than it will be if we don't. And the only way you could do this is if you get a director in place who will not only work the league process, but who also will work with all of you to help you do this going forward. And that's fundamentally what I'm about here. So I want to thank you all for taking the time. I hope this was useful to you. Please don't stop with the feedback. My email address, ab1oc@arrl.net, is how you reach me. Also, if you'd like to know more about what I've been doing, I've been already doing a lot of what I'm talking about doing as director. And if you want to learn more about what I do in amateur radio, go to elect.ab1oc.org. That's our website, and you can see what we're up to. And again, thank you. Whatever you do, please vote, make your vote count. And more important than anything, go out and make a difference, a positive difference for amateur radio. Don't just wait for the league to solve all the problems. They can't do it without you. So with that, I want to thank the panel for helping me and for all the great support and coaching I've received. 73, everybody, and we'll hopefully see you again very soon. Good night.